Hello and good morning, everybody, on this lovely, bright, sunny morning. And thank you for joining us today for this NLA event. I'm delighted to be chairing it. And first of all, I want to point out that, of course, I am not Ben. Unfortunately, Ben isn't very well today. I'm Jane Groom. I'm a board director and partner at London Communications Agency, but welcome. Today's session focuses on the proposed changes to the National Planning Policy Framework and also the new National Model Design Code. We'll be looking at what do planners, designers and developers need to know about the latest planning reforms, and how will this affect their practice and how they work, and most importantly, how will it also transform places across London and more widely across the UK. And this is really, really timely because I'm sure that you'll have seen that actually the government did announce just this week on Tuesday the latest plans and the latest design code model and planning policy framework. So there'll be a lot to talk about today. So this event is actually part of the NLA planning programme, and I'd like to thank the supporters as well, BECG. Now, just a few housekeeping rules. Please can I remind the audience that there will be a chance to ask our speakers questions, and I do hope you will join in the Q&A. That will be towards the end of the session, and you can send your questions by using the Q&A button on the Zoom function. So without more ado, because I'm sure we'd all like to hear more about the more developed plans in the NPPF and the new model design code, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is David Waterhouse, and he's the Head of Design and Planning Reform at MHCLG, and he's going to tell us more about the governance updates and the proposed code. So David, I know you've got a presentation. We look forward to it. Over to you.
Super, thanks very much. Can you hear me first of all, Jane?
We can indeed.
Excellent. Good. Okay, well, I'm apologies for the sort of IT challenges I'm facing, but I think the slides are now up on the system, so I hope that is working. Jane, is that working at your end?
It is working. I see Good. A lovely picture of Robert Jenrick.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's start. Great. Well, thanks very much and good morning, everyone. I'm David Waterhouse, Head of Design and Planning Reform at MHCLG, and we've had quite a busy week, I think it's fair to say, in getting out a huge package of announcements. But I think it's worth, before I sort of go into the detail on both the NPPF and the new National Model Design Code, just to sort of wind back a little bit, to really sort of gather us and think about the moment that's brought us to this point. And this builds on the recent, last year, the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and a real desire by the Secretary of State to put design at the heart of planning reforms as set out in the Planning White Paper published in August last year. And as you can see there, the Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick, who announced our package on Tuesday this week, clearly sets out there the role of the National Planning Policy Framework, the National Model Design Code, the Office for Place, and of course those wider reforms. So it is a fantastic opportunity to really brigade together all of these different elements to a really comprehensive package. I've been in the sort of planning, design, urban regeneration world for about sort of 15 years, and I don't think I've ever known a moment when we've had all of these things sort of align and come together. Next slide, please. So on Tuesday, the sort of summary of announcements really headlined by the new National Planning Policy Framework, which I think it's important to say applies in the current planning system. And I'll come on to a little more about the future later on in the presentation. But the NPPF that we launched on Tuesday applies immediately. That takes effect as of Tuesday, alongside the National Model Design Code, which we did go out for consultation on in January. I think the other sort of really key moment to reference is the Office for Place launch. And we're working through, obviously, the detail in terms of structure and governance, etc. But fantastic to have the advisory board chaired by Nicholas Boys-Smith, and I have no doubt that there are transition board members on this call this morning. But again, a really important moment for government to be taking design quality and placemaking and really providing a sort of bespoke energy and effort in the form of the Office for Place. We have been piloting, of course, and I'm going to come on in detail about this later on, the National Model Design Code in a number of geographies across the country, including in London, of course, And that has been hugely helpful in informing the sort of work of the design code. We also announced on Tuesday a expansion programme of that design code testing package, and those expressions of interest are due in early to mid-September. And I think it's also worth just saying that we will be running, in partnership with the Planning Advisory Service, a number of sessions to really unpack some of the detail of what might be required in the expression of interest. So I would encourage those of you that are in local authorities to look at the Planning Advisory website, and if you are interested in being part of the next phase of testing with funding associated to it, to come along to those sessions. Next slide. So on the National Planning Policy Framework specifically, really the sort of key things to tease out, and for those planning geeks like me, chapter 12 is the key one, and those amendments really put a very strong expectation in paragraphs 128 and 129 on the expectation of local authorities to produce design codes or guides, and that's further detailed in paragraph 134, where the emphasis is on approving good design and refusing poor design, and actually having really good reasons to do that. So I think those are sort of, the really sort of key parts of the revised document. But in addition to that, making beauty and placemaking a strategic objective of the planning system, putting that right up front in the new National Planning Policy Framework is a really big step change, and again one of those key moments, I think, in putting design at the heart of placemaking. So again, as we move into the new planning system, whenever that takes effect, this National Planning Policy Framework is the core document. It applies immediately, it is national planning policy, and decisions will need to be taken at local level in accordance with this document. Next slide. It's worth also just saying as well, alongside the NPPF, we do have planning practice guidance, the PPG suite, which is an online tool, and that is where the National Design Guide sits, alongside various other processes and tools for authorities, developers, applicants to engage with. And the National Design Guide should always be read in conjunction with the National Model Design Code. It's also worth saying clearly that these are material considerations in planning decision-making and planning applications. Next slide. And then just drilling down a little bit into the National Model Design Code, I'm sure you are all very familiar with this document and the guidance package that sits alongside it, but just sort of worth pulling out some key points really. So it's very much intended as a guide to local authorities. Everywhere is different, but it hopefully provides some clear parameters, some clear issues to think about where local authorities need to consider in their own contexts. And it really talks through about how to include design policy in local plans, in SPDs, or in other associated policy. And I think it's really an important resource. It's very visual, there's a lot of good material in there, and it's an important one-stop shop and one-stop resource for all applicants in the planning system. Next slide. So going a little further, the sort of three buckets, I suppose, are around climate, character and community, the three C's. So it isn't just about the sort of look and the feel and the architecture of new development. It's really much broader, thinking about the layout, thinking about the public spaces, thinking about nature and biodiversity, movement, character and identity. So it's much, much broader. And we've developed these 10 characteristics here under those three buckets of climate, character and community, 10 characteristics of well-designed places, which really allow for that suitable degree of variety, and they don't constrain technical and environmental innovation. So I think we need to, think of it very much about a holistic view of planning and placemaking, around healthy placemaking and around environmentally responsive placemaking that creates character, creates distinctive places, that really very much focuses on the sustainability agenda as well. Next slide. And I think it's really important also, you know, we can all point to examples of poor quality developments that have come through the planning system over the last, you know, 10, 20 and beyond years, but actually we need to celebrate the good. And that's why events like this are really important, and why through the National Design Guide and National Model Design Code, we are really focused on developing and promoting great development and great policy and great plans that actually yield good development that people enjoy living in. And I've just put up here a number of different schemes from across the country, which, you know, respond to their context, have different typologies, different built form, some, you know, in a rural context, some in a very urban context, some urban expansion and new settlement typologies, but actually they all have some key elements about functionality, about inclusivity, about integration, and being visually attractive. So I think it's really important, you know, to celebrate what the planning system can achieve and can deliver. And the design package announced on Tuesday goes a long way to making that the norm and not the exception. Next slide. So just sort of drilling into a little bit further about the application of design coding. So again, you know, the spatial tiering of where a design code applies can be flexible according to local circumstances. So that might be very micro level at a plot or a number of different plots that join together. It can equally be at a sort of broader, you know, development site, a master plan area, or an area of change, which is going to happen, and that can apply at that scale. Or lifting up again, it can be even at a much bigger area typology, where you've got a big area of change, a big regeneration zone, an enterprise zone, whatever it might be. Or indeed, some local authorities do have design guides and design codes that are across the totality of their area. So I think it's about flexibility, it's about local circumstances, and it's ensuring that the overarching design vision can apply at the right level of geography in an area. Next slide. Also worth thinking as well around master planning and the principles of master planning as they relate to a design code. So clearly here, you know, very important, a master plan is often produced by a developer landowner, potentially in partnership with a local planning authority, oftentimes used as a sort of guide to attract inward investment, but thinking again about how a master plan can guide an application of a code is really important. And, you know, there are really great examples of master plans that have come through the system. I always constantly go back to the old CABE guidance on, you know, creating good master plans, which is quite elderly now, but again, some really strong principles in there. And I think it's just worth thinking about, you know, how in the sort of current climate, how we, you know, think about master plans in a broader way about green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, climate change, adaptation rather, and flexibility as well. So we shouldn't divorce design codes and master plans. They are, you know, they are intrinsically linked. Next slide. And underpinning all of this clearly is the importance of community engagement in the planning system, and the work of that we've put out in the planning white paper, and indeed the principles that still apply in the National Planning Policy Framework, really front load the system in terms of community engagement. The NMDC, the National Model Design Code, talks about workshops, design charrettes, walking audits, etc. And the pilots that I'll come on to talk about are really probing much more into what types of community engagement work in different contexts. And I think it's worth saying that in the sort of thrust of the planning reforms as they come forward, you will see a very strong emphasis on engagement tools, techniques and processes, because that is a tenet of the whole package. So really important to flag that at this point. Next slide. So I've talked a little bit about the testing programme of the National Model Design Code, and worth saying that we are testing a whole range of different elements of the reformed planning system, or the proposals rather, that were set out in the white paper. So we have a number of pilots across the country, looking at digital, looking at the new local plan allocation system, looking at reforms to the community infrastructure levy. And then we have this pilot testing programme, which is looking at the National Model Design Code in 14 different local authorities across the 8 English regions, including London, of course. And a really rich, diverse range of testing typologies in rural contexts, looking at new settlements, looking at estate regeneration, and also tackling, big issues such as, the future of retail and how do we sort of think about a high street design code in the context of adaptability to changing retail patterns. So I'll come on to a little bit more detail on that, but just worth being aware that we've got a really rich and strong range across the country, which we hope to expand in the second wave, as I highlighted earlier. Next slide, please. And this is the sort of typology. Apologies, this will be really small and a bit blurry for you, I'm sure, but you can see there that we've got sort of 4 basic typologies across rural, large sites or urban extensions, town centre or urban neighbourhoods, and then city centre regen. And this grid basically sets out, who they are, what are the authorities, what are they aiming to sort of produce, what's the expected output, and then what aspect of the design code is being tested. And I'm sure we can make these slides available at the end for people to read these in a bit more detail. But again, that sort of richness of testing the National Model Design Code will be really important to understand what is working, and then what might be replicable, what are some of the sort of common conditions that can be applied in different contexts, in different situations across the country. So it's a really important programme that the team are leading. Next slide. And just sort of drilling down into, just to give this a little bit of shape and colour, we've got, I'll just sort of highlight a few. So Portsmouth, on the south coast, quite significant regen issues, testing the design code application in 2 particular contexts. One, a very large footprint retail store in the centre of the city, which has gone, and what do you do with that? How do you reimagine that? And how do you use that as an opportunity for wider regeneration, but also start to think about the urban realm, the public realm surrounding that development. And then also a classic sort of estate regeneration scheme, so 2 tower blocks, and this is in another part of Portsmouth. How do you deal with consultation fatigue? How do you start to sort of bring together something that delivers tangible outcomes? And how do you start on the journey where actually there is, people can see things starting to change and happen, rather than waiting for the big bang of, the master plan being invoked. So really interesting mix. And what it's exposed is actually, in local government, there's so many different priorities and different areas of focus that local authority internal teams, need to be brought into the sort of process, and it's really sort of exposed some of those wider issues, I suppose, at corporate level in local government. I'll rattle on because I'm conscious of the time, so next slide please. Moving to a very different context, which I realise for a London audience isn't perhaps that relevant, but this is applying the National Model Design Code in a very rural application, where there is a neighbourhood plan parish system in place already. So the neighbourhood plans that exist in Herefordshire were really first out of the starting blocks when we introduced the neighbourhood plan system, and a lot of them do focus on design and heritage matters because of the context in those areas. But then how do you start to really apply some of the sort of principles in the National Model Design Code for new development in those areas? And how do you start to use digital techniques in an area where there are, digital challenges of, simple things like, Wi-Fi access and all sorts of things like that. So we need to sort of understand what the issues and challenges there are in an area where there is housing demand, and actually villages want to expand to accommodate people that want to live in those villages from their own area. So a really interesting challenge there in rural Herefordshire. Next slide. And then this is a particular favourite of mine because I love new towns. This is Hemel Hempstead in Hertfordshire, one of the original Mark I new towns. Really, the challenge, of course, with new towns is all the infrastructure housing, retail and hard infrastructure was all built at the same time, so it's all aging at the same time. So there are big challenges about how you redevelop and reimagine and regenerate a lot of the Mark I new towns. So Dacorum Borough Council here are looking at an industrial estate that adjoins the town centre, and how do you start to reimagine the town centre with different uses and identity, and then think about a coordinated approach for design coding into this industrial estate, and how do you start to sort of merge those two things and sort of create a bit more sort of flow and a bit more focus and legibility through the two areas. So it's quite an interesting example. And again, the applicability of this in other Mark I new towns will be quite interesting, because for Hemel Hempstead, read Stevenage, read Harlow, read Basildon, etc. So the purpose of the testing is to think, right, well, what are the issues and what are the challenges, and how could that be replicated elsewhere in terms of application of principles, recognising, of course, that everywhere is different. Next slide. So just sort of moving towards the end, I mean, clearly the big elephant in the room here is resources, capacity, capability and skills. And that is really very much why the Office for Place has been established, to champion, to promote, to advocate and to provide support. And we're delighted Nicholas Boyce-Smith is chairing the Office for Place, supported very ably by an expert advisory board. Where we launched it on Tuesday, so we're in very early days of this at the moment, but there's an awful lot of work going on, and there's clearly also a huge range of expertise as well across the patch on skills. All of the work that Esther Kurland, who may or may not be on this call from Urban Design Learning, does with her coding school in disseminating that good practice, all of the work that Public Practice has done. We need to draw on all of that work, and indeed the report, which I've not yet digested, from Matthew Carmona at the Place Alliance, that was published indeed yesterday, I think. So, we need to take that seriously in delivering the planning reform package, and indeed these announcements. The resources, skills and capability bit is absolutely fundamental. Next slide. So just turning then to the future, clearly the big focus now is on delivering the planning white paper through a planning bill. We have announced that we will be taking that planning bill forward shortly, and that will come through in the autumn. Clearly the detail on all of this in terms of policy and the legislative instructions is being worked up currently. My team are very busy writing instructions for lawyers, which is a whole new language. So that is a big focus really at the moment. More immediately, getting the learning out of the piloting programme on the National Model Design Code and getting applications in through the phase 2 of the testing programme. That's the sort of immediate priority. And then more broadly, I think there's a really interesting conversation and opportunity in bigger elements. So, the fact that the UK is hosting COP26 in later on in the year in October. How are we thinking about the built environment in the context of climate change and the net zero trajectory, and what adaptations and mitigations need to be put in place at a bigger spatial scale? There's then obviously the big challenge of levelling up and the sort of economic rebalancing post-COVID, but also turning around some of the sort of more long-seated, deep-seated challenges in towns. And the government, our department, has developed the Towns Fund and the Levelling Up Fund. All of that, of course, is fine, but the challenge is going to come through spending review as we go into what is going to be a very tight spending round in the autumn. So, that sort of levelling up agenda and that investment piece is going to be fundamental. And then underpinning all of this, of course, is the sort of digital piece. And in the white paper, we were very clear about the digitisation of the planning system, making it much more easily navigable, doing away with great great loads of PDF products and various other things. So digital systems, engagement, training, really important as well. So I've whistled through a lot there. I've taken far too much time. I will stop there and hand back to the chair, Jane, for questions. Thank you.
David, Very much, hugely informative. Lots and lots of information there, and particularly important that we all understand that it comes in with immediate effect from Tuesday, as I think you said in your presentation. I'd now like to turn to the panel to respond first of all, and then we will take Q&A a bit later on. I'd firstly like to ask David Joyce, who's the Director for Housing Regeneration and Planning at Haringey Council, to respond, because clearly this is going to have a really big impact on local authorities. There's a lot for them to do, a lot for them to take into account. And I'd particularly like to understand what it means in terms of resourcing, which is something, David, that you did mention as well. So David, over to you, please.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you to the NLA for running this event, which is incredibly timely, as you've said, and to David for that presentation, which was really engaging. And I have to say, one of the things, brilliant things about David is that he does make sure that he and his team get out and about and talk to practitioners. I recall him visiting Camden when I was director there, for instance, and I think you can really see that commitment to engaging the sector is fed through to some really well considered proposals around achieving great design. So I do commend David and his team for that, especially because I'm sure it's never easy working in a huge government machine. Secondly, it was great to see the Secretary of State reference his desire that good design, ready access to nature and high environmental standards should be for all, from Haringey to Hartlepool. So we felt special that we were mentioned in that way. And it follows on from Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester, setting a test that levelling up will have happened when bus fares in Harperhay match those in Haringey. So we're interested to see what H-named place we will be twinned with next by a national political figure. But in terms of the proposals and the updated NPPF and what we've heard about from David today, I think in Haringey and I know in many parts of the sector, we think there's a lot of potential with the approach to shift from reactive planning to real planning, if that makes sense, which actually reflects local placemaking and heritage and considers what makes a place special. This is something that for our cabinet actually in Haringey has been placed absolutely at the heart of their administration, starting with what makes a place special, what makes a community, and how can we build on that. And so I think a lot of what we've heard today has huge potential, and certainly something that we want to see, where we're enacting major change in places and where we're seeing major change in places like Wood Green, Tottenham Hale, and North Tottenham, where there's really significant regeneration underway. And it's great to have much stronger wording on being able to refuse poor quality design and replacing some of the sort of really disappointing wording in previous iterations, like obviously poor design. I think it's got us into a much stronger place. But, and there is always going to be a but, I think in order to do so, we do need to move from a world where funding for planning is almost entirely focused on reactive planning through application fees, and by the way, not in a way that we can recover our costs, rather than what I would describe as real planning, which is planning ahead through local plans, working with local communities on design codes, co-production, and making sure that local communities can help shape the way that their places should be designed. And I think it was good to hear David reference that resourcing remains a bit of an elephant in the room, and I know governments are actively considering this, and bodies like the Royal Town Planning Institute have put forward some really good proposals, and local authorities are being quite vocal on this. So just encourage that engagement to continue around how do we resource the really important part of the planning system. And it is sometimes worth looking outside of the United Kingdom. And the NLA is actually very good at helping us to do that. They ran a series of events with New York City's chief planner that some may remember a couple of years ago. And I do remember her reactions. It was a really good series of sessions, but she basically talked about the fact that zoning and design codes have to be locally led, and that councils need to have the power and tools and money to genuinely plan. And from what she heard of the UK planning system at the time, she felt it sounded like it was centrally imposed, and local authorities were given neither the tools nor the money to implement. and she was slightly appalled by the nationally imposed permitted development regime. And I mean, David won't be surprised to hear me saying this. Local authorities have been consistently critical of it, but it is disappointing and I think slightly incongruous that at the very time we're hearing a really positive set of proposals around design, the government is simultaneously rolling out permitted development to other areas and making it harder in the wording in the NPPF for councils to implement Article 4 directions to control that where we think it is sensible. So I think that is disappointing and it does feel slightly incongruous. I think my sort of final thing that I would say is it's important to recognise that the planning system has already made a lot of improvement. You know, we need to recognise, and certainly in my most recent authorities of Camden and Haringey, you know, both have set in place a significant chain of improvements around design. Design review panels are now core to all major applications. Proactive master planning sits behind nearly all of the growth areas in both of those councils, and I know that approach is seen across London. We now have a really you know, well-resourced pre-application engagement and design advice service in most local authorities across London, and design awards are very common to celebrate good design. And we can see that coming through now. And I was interested that the Secretary of State visited the Bourne Estate in Camden this week as a great example. And equally, you know, I can point to other great schemes across London, you know, including in Haringey, such as the Clarendon scheme in Wood Green that's been led by St James. So I think the existing system was starting to bear fruit. So I did just want to say that I welcome the fact that the Secretary of State has dialed down the rhetoric around this being the most radical reform since the Second World War, and has actually moved his language to say we don't need to rip up the planning system and start again. That I think is welcome. The planning bill, which is yet to be published, will be important. And we do welcome the indication that there'll be a pre-legislative draft for consultation, and I hope that we will see that so we can comment on the detail. And as I sort of referred to earlier, I'd be really keen that government listens to local authorities. The Royal Town Planning Institute have done a really good submission, and really starts to think about how do we give local authorities the tools to make this happen and the resources to make it happen. You know, one of the things we all love about London is the villages, the different parts of London, the character, the diversity, and certainly, and I take no credit for this because most of the good work in King's Cross was done even before I arrived in Camden, sort of 12 years ago. But you know, the fact that Camden then had put in place such a strong master plan and fought hard to retain the heritage at King's Cross, I don't think the council is given enough credit for the great place that has emerged out the other side of that. But I think we could equally point to some examples where new places in London feel soulless and without character. And it's just so important, in my view, that we recognise the important role of local authorities and as I say, give us the tools, the money and the skills that are necessary to sort of really deliver on this agenda, because we can see the difference that it makes. But you know, largely really would want to thank David for that presentation, and hopefully can add some further thoughts later on in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So a message there to the other David about having the kind of necessary tools and resources to actually deliver this. But I think there was quite a lot to be welcomed there, though some caveats as well about things to be careful of. Okay, now I'd like to move on to Salma, who's the Director of Urban Design and Master Planning at Arup. And I'd like to ask, you know, what benefits and challenges do you see as part of proposed reforms in terms of the master planning, particularly in terms of different areas across the capital?
Just a minute while I unmute myself. So thank you very much, Jane, and thank you, David, for your presentation. I really welcome the very clearly written and sort of well illustrated document, which is the code, with its emphasis on sort of visual and numerical descriptions of good design, and particularly welcome the proposals to re-establish good principles of urban forms, such as well-proportioned streets and clear building lines and sort of hierarchy of routes, safe, active experience on ground floors, and so on. And I think it's quite right at this stage to put beauty and inclusive placemaking seen in a holistic way as a priority agenda back into the planning process. We often talk about considerations like viability, deliverability, sustainability. We hear it all the time, but putting placemaking back into that list of top priorities, I think really important. I think it's also, and Jane, coming to your question, I think it's important to note, as the code itself does, that the design code is just one tool in the toolbox, and there are many other complementary tools that we can use to make sure great design is achieved, such as, for London, we have the manual for streets that talk about good streets, an excellent master plan framework, which, as David Joyce pointed out, many sort of large schemes in London do have very sophisticated master plans that are coming forward. There's, of course, the 10 principles of the National Design Guide, a focus on enhancing the health of our city by a focus on sort of citywide systems. We have London's green-blue grid, and how do we make sure that slowly we sort of reestablish those systems as key elements of enjoying our cities, our walking and cycling networks, and so on. So thinking about how this applies to London, which is quite a unique context and really has the full spectrum of area types that the code describes, from from the outer peri-urban areas to sort of large schemes in central London. And I think the code gives some very good guidance, I think particularly more relevant for the infill projects and perhaps the self-build and custom-build schemes that might be coming out in smaller sites that are more embedded in various London boroughs and outer zones, perhaps. And I say it's more relevant for that because I think the large complex schemes in central London, the large brownfield sites, already tend to have master plans, and they develop codes and guidelines anyway. And of course, achieving good quality in those schemes are equally important. But I think there's quite a lot of focus on that anyway. I mean, one question would be whether codes could be usefully, more detailed codes could be usefully embedded in local plans or in opportunity area frameworks, for example, which gives out the message of what is expected. I mean, as David said, the real planning, what can we say something about what kinds of places we expect before proposal really comes forward? I think one of your examples in London is Southwark Council is one of the pilot schemes, I think, and it'll be quite useful to see how they begin to apply it, because Southwark does have some very dense central areas, but also other areas, and just really great to see how that would come forward. The other point I'd like to make is, one of your 4 points was more tree-lined streets, getting nature back into the city. I think a really, really important priority and consideration across many fronts. And code places a real emphasis on that. And it's something that I think London should truly embrace. Now, London is already quite green, and actually there are a couple of boroughs in London. I think it's Camden and Croydon that featured in the top 20 places in England and Wales with the most tree cover, which is quite interesting, boosted, of course, by gardens. But you see less of it in public areas and streets, and that's not because people don't want it, but in places like London, I think providing sort of good tree canopy and cover means working very closely with infrastructure, because a lot of London has stuff underground on pavements, in plazas, and so how do you actually achieve that as a design objective? I think there's some working hand in hand that's really required. And finally, a point about existing places. So the codes talk a lot about new places, new towns. But what is the role of the code in the very significant volume of work that's going to be coming up to make our existing buildings and districts more energy efficient, in particular, the big net zero agenda, and changing our building envelope for the large number of homes and other buildings will be really necessary. It's around the corner. We will see a lot of innovation in this area through modern methods of construction and circular economy models, for example. I'll just give you one little example. Just yesterday, a colleague of mine at Arup was flagged up a really interesting research project. It's a pilot project that's being undertaken by the Technical University in Delft. So what they're doing is developing a circular business model based on the use of sort of multifunctional facade systems as performance delivering tools. So under this scheme, the client is no longer the owner of the building envelope. You don't purchase panels or bricks or windows. You actually lease them from a service provider through a long-term building performance contract. This is, of course, in real pilot stages, but innovations like this are going to be absolutely necessary and are going to come forward if we are to accelerate the rate and depth of energy renovations that we're going to be requiring. So the question would be, should we be writing some of these codes for the building materials industry equally, rather than just the architects and developers? Should we not target that audience? Because you might end up with a supply chain that's actually dictating what your places are going to be looking like. So just a few things to keep in mind. I mean, there's huge disruption in our industry, as we all know. But in summary, really, really pleased that placemaking and beauty is back on the agenda, but have to keep an eye on the horizon because there's a lot of initiatives going on there that we need to sort of tie up with. Thank you, and back to you, Jane.
Thank you. Some very insightful comments there and some food for thought. I'd now like to turn to our last panelist, who's Anna, who's a Planning Director London at BDP. Anna, how will the design code affect the kind of work of architects and planners? And what do you think are both the benefits and challenges that these new reforms will bring?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think to start with, just to thank the other speakers. I think I agree with a lot of what's been said, but also maybe some slightly different thoughts as well. Overall, the architecture and planning professions are sort of very, very excited and welcoming of these changes. To put that greater emphasis on design is absolutely key, and a very positive move forward. I suppose one of the things that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with is the use of the word beauty, which in my sort of opinion doesn't necessarily mean well-designed places, and is quite a sort of superficial approach to design. And I think the saying beauty is only skin deep comes to mind, and that we need to look at more meaningfully designed places and an approach to design. It's more than just what it looks like, and that's certainly, I think, the intent of the detail of it. But when people maybe only are looking at the headlines, or I can imagine a councillor in a committee just using the word beautiful and not really understanding that design is more than that. I think we just need to be careful about that going forward. I think one of the other things that I think is really important in these sort of changes on the final version is broadening it out to not just design codes, but design guidance. And having sort of produced a few different design guides for local authorities over the years, there's usually a combination of both. And coding is very important, when you're maybe at the more site level or small areas. But there's a lot that needs to be, more as in terms of guidance, rather than sort of strict codes. And I think that comes into sort of the other element, which is important, that design codes and guides are part of supplementary planning documents so that they have some material weight. But then when you come to actually writing those, a lot of the time, because it needs to have an evidence base, and kind of comply with sort of policy sort of restrictions, you do have to temper the language. So a lot of the time you might start with being quite forthright in making it a code, but have to strip it back to guidance because you're going to sort of stifle development in terms of viability and things like that. So I think it's really important to think about those constraints going forward. I think one of the things that I'm maybe a little bit concerned about is, obviously there's a lot of focus on housing, which is good, but I think when it comes to actually local areas producing these sort of design guides, to really think about the other uses, businesses, industrial, leisure, supermarkets, university, hospitals, they're not always things that, it's not a lovely little hamlet or a local high street. These are much larger scale, and I suppose thinking about London, the scale is important as well. And a lot of the examples in the code are not, the density and scale that's sort of applicable to London. So I think there's an extra challenge that needs to go there as well. I think it's really important that there's a reference to a range of tools. and it's not just about guides and codes. But I think remembering that it's still design is subjective, and there needs to be sort of flexibility for other competing kind of planning issues. And I think one of the key things is that it does involve people, and that's really key. And I think David referenced early on the report from the Place Alliance that came out yesterday, the design deficit. And just some of the headlines for that is that 3/4 of local planning authorities have no in-house architectural advice, 2/3 have no landscape advice, and 2/5 have no urban design advice. And as much as I do think quality review panels have a place, that's very different for them having in-house officers who really understand local areas, understand design and its nuance, and work really collaboratively with applicant design teams. That's quite a different process to a QRP that can be used at key stages in design, but it's set up a lot of the time like an architectural school crit. There's no two-way dialogue. It can be quite a blunt instrument. So I think there's place for both of those. And I would sort of, I think, probably echo what David Joyce was saying earlier about, that the in-house skills are really, really key in implementing this. And I think, speaking from experience working with lots of design teams, always very keen to work collaboratively with in-house design officers. And I think sometimes it's that one-way QRP that can be not always result in good quality design. And then I think just my very final point, local communities are absolutely key as part of this. There's a lot of talk about the techniques to engage them, but from my experience, I think it's also about the content and how some of these things are kind of communicated in the nuanced detail. And it's actually quite hard to often engage communities on a design guide when it gets to that stage, because they can't sort of see what does this actually mean. They're quite good at looking at a development and saying I like this or don't like that, but when you're talking in that sort of more theoretical guides and codes, it's not easy to understand. So I think in those pilots, I think it would be really useful to get some innovative ideas about how you've actually got people to come along to events to talk about those types of things, or to provide feedback, because that's something I know we've struggled with in the past.
No, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for raising the kind of notion of beauty. And I've been thinking about whether actually beauty is subjective or not, but that's a whole other debate I think we could spend a long time discussing. I'd like to pick up your point actually about community engagement, and maybe I can put a question here to David in a moment. Because at London Communications Agency, we obviously do a lot of stakeholder and community engagement, and I think one of the things that's been so interesting about kind of COVID and lockdown, if we can say that anything positive has come out of it at all, is actually that we've all been using much more digital methods. And we found that actually that has encouraged a whole range of different people to become involved in the engagement process, talking about plans. It's less self-selecting. People are more likely to come online and join a virtual event or a webinar, or you can do virtual workshops online. And I think more people are actually feel confident perhaps in asking questions if they don't necessarily have to stand up, kind of at a planning committee or something like that. So I think it's interesting in terms of the reach of these tools, and obviously these should be considered as part of the round of the different techniques that I know the design code is looking at, and there is a big emphasis on digital. But David, I wonder if I could put a quick question to you before we then look at some of the questions in the chat, and that is, I know Joan Rick's been talking about, lovely streets and tree-lined streets, but I wanted to talk just a little bit about height and density, which I know Anna has spoken about as well. I think you said in the policy exchange kind of debate that there is a place for tall buildings. You mentioned 1 or 2 areas in London. I'm not sure if the local communities would necessarily agree, but maybe some of those communities feel they've already had enough of tall buildings. I mean, do you think there's a potential tension here between trying to work with local communities, and engage with them, but also the need to build some things in the right places with height and certain level of density to actually create the number of new homes we need for the capital?
Thanks very much, Chair, for those comments. I think the point I would make about height and density, you know, delivering increased numbers of housing and thinking about the sort of layout and the typology and sort of the form of those houses and you know, residential units, to get increased density, you don't necessarily have to build tall. And I think, you know, if you look at some of the sort of more dense neighbourhoods, parts of London and indeed other cities, you know, terraced housing in Manchester, etc., you know, actually quite dense. So this notion of, you know, density and height is a little bit misleading in some ways. However, the caveat there is that if you do, you know, have this sort of notion of gentle density, then that's where, linking back to the point on trees, on green space, on areas that are public and private, you need to think and you need to plan for, you know, those elements as part of any new development. You know, there is height and tall buildings, there are appropriate places for such developments, but I think, you know, certainly over the last sort of 10-15 years, there have been, you know, tall buildings taken out of the planning system, approved potentially through, you know, by the inspectorate for good reason, but actually, you know, is it based in policy? Is there a clear policy understanding of what is appropriate where and why height is required? So I think the justification, the bar for justification, needs to be higher. And I think, you know, when you do look at density, think at different typologies and different layers as well. But linking back to the sort of community engagement point, I mean, yes, I agree completely. The sort of the pandemic has in a way been a democratizer in some ways, because it has brought, you know, it has brought sort of planning committees, it has brought engagement with, you know, let's be honest, we're all professionals in this. I'm a town planner, I'm sure everyone on the line is architect, urban designer, planner, etc. We're all professionals in this, but actually if you're engaging in this world from, you know, a resident perspective or even a business perspective, this is completely alien to you, and the language and the terminology is completely alien. So actually, you know, having online tools and having the ability to engage through, you know, online things like this, you know, reaches a much wider audience. At our launch on Tuesday, we had, I think, 980 people on the line. I mean, you know, we'd never have an event for 980 people. So I think, you know, we need to harness what has been a good, harness the positives and think about how does that work in a sort of hybrid world, and we're all feeling our way in that.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things we've found so successful actually is digital surveys, which you can promote by social media. So the other thing we've found is we're reaching a completely different demographic, much younger demographic, who are the people who are actually going to benefit from new homes, and kind of much more kind of positive in engaging about the different types of uses that they might be able to interact with on the ground floor, you know, whether that's leisure or cafes or whatever. So thank you, no, that's really helpful. So quickly going to the chat, because I'm aware that we've only got 5 minutes left, and I can't believe how time flies when you're enjoying yourself. Never thought I'd say that about the NPPF, but so we got a question from Andrea from Re London, who said that yesterday the route map to zero avoidable waste in construction was published, and this is with support from DEFRA. And what she's really asking is, to actually achieve this route map, it's going to require support from yourselves as a department. So she'd like to know, David, is your team actually collaborating with DEFRA to include the relevant aspects in the upcoming planning bill?
So we have a really strong engagement with DEFRA, and not least because they are in the same building as us. So 2 Marsham Street, where we're headquartered, is the Home Office, MHCLG and DEFRA, so that helps. We are engaging DEFRA very closely on a whole range of issues, on local nature recovery strategies, on the journey to net zero, on nutrients and the challenge of nutrients and nutrients in new development on greenfield sites. There's a whole range of issues that we're engaging very closely on, as well as the role of DEFRA's statutory agencies, including Natural England and the Environment Agency, and their role going forward in the new planning system. So just yesterday we had a really good cross-Whitehall roundtable with all relevant government departments, because the reform package touches on a lot of whole range of pretty much every government department, from Ministry of Justice through to One Public Estate work, through to DFE, through to DEFRA. So the short answer is yes. We can never get into every single bit of policy that every single bit of government is doing, but I think that just shows the power of planning in that it reaches so far.
Yeah, absolutely. David, thank you very much indeed for that response. I'm going to start bringing things to a close here. I mean, just in terms of timing of this event, I mean, I found it extremely informative. David, your presentation was great. There was so much detail in there, and I'm sure that everyone else on this session today has found it really, really helpful. So thank you very much indeed for your time today. I'd like to also thank everyone for attending, and also particularly to the rest of the panel of speakers. Thank you very much indeed for your very thoughtful contributions. I know before we close that we're going to have a short poll for the audience to actually give us some feedback. David, you'll be glad to know I don't think it's a feedback on the on the design code, so don't worry about that. I think it's about future NLA events. So just to thank everyone again for the time this morning. Enjoy the rest of a lovely sunny day, and we look forward to working with local authorities and to looking more at the detail of how the design code and the NPPF pans out in the future. So thank you again. Thank you.